طيب بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. I would like to welcome you all to this, I would call it early morning session about the climate, poverty and finance, the role of the private sector. Before we start, I would like to welcome our esteemed panelist, Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin, the UN Climate High-Level Champion for the COP27. Dr. Susanna Gabel, the Deputy Director, Development Policy and Finance, the Gates Foundation, and Dr. Farah Sungwei, the co-chair high-level expert panel on climate finance and COP28. And my name is Mohammed Al-Yami. I'm the Director of the Development Effectiveness Office at the ICD, the private sector arm of the Islamic Development Bank. We started a bit late, so we'll just go directly to the session. The session will be recorded and it will be shared through the social media starting from tomorrow. The theme of the session is really about how can investment in climate projects and programs help directly or even indirectly in alleviating poverty. And I think who better can talk about this if we have this panel here. Maybe Dr. Mahmoud, there is no questions to be asked unless there is something, but if you can please maybe give us a bit background of the history of the COP, then the floor is yours to talk about this, theory of change, finance, climate and poverty.
Right. Thank you so much for the kind invitation, and happy to be part of this discussion. And we look forward, as well as I've been discussing with His Excellency, the President of the Islamic Development Bank, that this session could be built on as well for the big events that the Islamic Development Bank is preparing for the celebration of the 50th anniversary. So it would be hard to go back to the almost 30 years of history of the COPs. This year, the 28th COP, and before getting into the COP, there were many years in preparation. There were other arrangements before that, but I like to just to get into the kind of evolution on the understanding of how climate action should be more linked to SDGs, and what did we suffer from because of that false dichotomy between climate action and development action, and what we are doing differently now. And I was mentioning that in a meeting that we had yesterday during the discussion of an important report that Dr. Vera Songwe, who is with us today, led with Nick Stern and a very important group of experts from around the world. And in different ways, you can read this extensive report. But in the way that the report was shared last year and this year, is telling us that any action that we are doing and any action that we are missing for climate is very much either a development action or missing an opportunity in achieving one of the goals. And this is very much common sense, because we know that the actionable areas of work when it comes to climate action are either on energy or industrial transformation, which is the topic of the day. And this is basically reminding us of two important SDGs, SDG 7 on energy and SDG 8 on the role of economic growth and industrial transformation. Adaptation, which was very much missing from the discussion. It was very much opaque, vague. People talk about adaptation, but as everybody, especially from the business sector, started to appreciate that the breakdown of opportunities in adaptation had been realized in the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda. And what we saw on the opportunities, either in water management, SDG 6, or in areas related to food, like SDG 2, and matters related to investment and resilience, SDG 11. So this kind of dichotomy didn't really help us achieving the climate action. because some people said that let's be more focused, but we didn't end up to be more focused, and there had been a duplication of work, confusion in the design of policies. And when it comes to finance, we are aware of cases that suffered from duplication and lack of good arrangements for projects. And I would say for a world that is now suffering from the fact, despite some progress here and there, we cannot deny that, but given that we are not on track to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement by 2030 and for the net zero targets by 2050, and we are strongly reminded, especially by the updates coming from the UN system, about the lack of achievement on the SDG front. We're only on track in the trajectory to achieve the 2030 only by 12% of the targets. We have 55 targets either slightly off track or significantly off track, and even worse, we are 35% of the targets of what we managed to measure of the targets are worse than what were started in 2015. So I think the strong message demonstrated by evidence and identifying even the gaps of finance from domestic side or external side, as this report by Vera and Extern, or the work that had more emphasis on the multilateral development banks and their role by Professor Singh and Professor Summers, which are basically, given that many of the members of the first report were members of the second report, and what they produced of results makes sense at the global level, we see the same confirmation. So what to do next? I'm happy that Susanna Gabel, with her ability to coordinate effectively groups of experts, they were members of the SDG Council of the UE that was formed during the government summit. So last year we produced an important report on the links between climate and poverty, and Susanna is here. She can share the findings and what should we really be doing in action. So we had the launching of this report last year, and this year as well we used it in an event just a few days ago between the champions of climate and the presidency of COP28 and Gates Foundation, and many others were there as well. But it's all about the practical steps on how to do better in finance, in technology, in research and development, and incentives, because of any of these goals that I mentioned that suffered the most during the last 3 years in particular was poverty and inequality. Thank you.
Said this is an open discussion, so there is no structural questions. But something just came to my mind now from Dr. Mahmoud, talk, that all these figures showing that we are really behind in achieving. But on the other side of this equation, I just heard yesterday that some countries in Africa, only 9% of the people or citizens have access to electricity. So how can we make the balance between people's needs, who are really suffering, and being, top technology, clean energy, climate friendly? So this is another thought, but please, ladies, who would like to continue the discussion that started by Dr. Mahmoud?
Thank you. First of all, let me start by thanking the Islamic Development Bank for inviting us here. It's always a pleasure to be on the panel with my distinguished co-panelist, Susanna, and of course, Mahmoud. I think Mahmoud has laid out a little bit, the history of the COP and where we want to be, and some of the tensions around the financing, and two or three things that we are seeing happening at this COP is, first of all, maybe some, clarity on the numbers and the financing. On Tuesday, there was the Climate Finance Framework Declaration of Leaders, that was signed by an important number of leaders led by the UAE. We have at the Africa Climate Summit, $4.5 billion that was announced for energy transitions on the continent, and that's where I come to your question. I don't think that there is a divorce between 9% of the population. I'm not sure which country. I don't know any country in Africa that is only 9%. But let's say that there's 600 million people on the continent that do not have access to energy, and so part of our fight is to make sure that those people have access to energy. But we want more than that. It's not just 600 people have access to energy. We actually want industrialization, so we need energy to industrialize. And so we need a lot more energy. But that is not in contradiction with renewables and clean. In many of the countries on the continent today, actually already, it's an interesting mix, right? We have a lot of use, unfortunately, of fossil fuels. One, some of it destroying our forest. It is women and cooking. Then we have a diesel, because we don't have refineries. And then we actually have countries like Senegal or Cameroon in Central Africa, where we had 80% renewable energy because we have hydro, right? And so, but what we would like to do is to say the benefit of those that do not have energy is that we don't have to go through the fossil fuel stage, or at least we can do some gas, but we can also, if you're Kenya, you can do geothermal. If you're Cameroon, you can do more hydro. If you're Namibia, you can now leapfrog to hydrogen. If you're Mauritania, you can do hydrogen. So in some sense, and that immediately meets with what Mahmoud was talking about, we can already, in our effort to access energy, do it cleanly or in a green fashion, because we also have, the wind, the sun, the water, and the hydrogen now, and the uranium if we wanted to go nuclear as well. So we have all of the basic core materials. I think the important conversation has always been the financing and how we do the financing. And I think that's where the Islamic Development Bank and the rest of us become interesting and important, is that we're now talking in Africa about green industrialization. It's not just about putting the energy plant. It's also about using that energy to produce something that creates jobs. Because as we all know, Africa is becoming more middle income. Africa is becoming more cities-based. In the next 10 years, Africa will be all cities, right? We will have 70% of our population living in cities. And those cities are going to require housing, they're going to require, and then they'll start buying fridges and cookers and all that, and they're going to need more energy. But we need jobs to make this an organized transition from the rural to the cities. And to do that, you need to then begin to produce and have more industry. And so we believe that, we've seen in Europe, for example, the CBAM, the Common Border Adjustment Mechanism, that is saying we don't want to import anything that's not greenly produced. So if you're Mauritania and you have iron ore, or if you're Egypt and you have steel, you still want to export it. But now if there's a tariff that goes up because you're not producing it with clean energy, we need to start seeing how we can make sure that all of these things are done in a clean way so we can continue to export them. And I think this is really the new sort of green industrialization strategy that combines providing energy, providing jobs, so that, we're talking about $1 trillion, and we just released the climate finance framework. Since you're going to be on a thing, I'm doing my publicity for my report, but we just did the report with Nick Stern, and Amma Bhattacharya and Eleanor. And what we're saying in the report is we need a lot of de-risking. But my sense is there's a different kind of de-risking. A de-risking that says investors come and do the offtake. If you can guarantee an offtake, then we don't need so much risk money or de-risking resources, right? We will be able to then, redeploy those resources that today we are putting to de-risk and provide guarantees, because the best guarantee is an off-taker, right? If I have Masdar as my off-taker, I don't need any guarantee. And so if we can do that, I think we begin to change a little bit the conversation. And the small resources that the MDBs, 100 billion that you have, can then go even much further. So we need to mobilize you, not only to give us finance, but to mobilize you to bring industry to us, so that we can work much better and much more effectively together.
Thank you, Faraz. Susanna, maybe you will elaborate more about the work that has been mentioned by Dr. Mahmoud. He just mentioned now the report.
Yeah, so
Or whatever you would like, please. I mean,
sure. Yeah, so the report is really about taking the discussion down from the global level a little bit, because at the global level we all agree we need to definitely achieve both climate goals and the poverty reduction goals. But when it comes to the actual decisions and implementation, those will happen at the country level, among businesses, or among households in their consumption. So going down a level, we put ourselves in the shoes of, for example, a finance minister in a low-income country compared to a middle-income country or a high-income country. And the preferences and the type of trade-offs you're facing will change as a country develops. As will, of course, the level of financing you have available, but also the mix of financing you have available, so the type of financing you have available. And if we keep talking about these things at the global level, it becomes so general and an assumption that everyone should do the same, but that's not reality. Just looking at the mobilized private capital as we see now, 13% of that goes to low-income countries, 7% goes to social sectors, and only 4% goes to adaptation. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is why doesn't private capital flow there to begin with? And there's clearly enough projects that would like to have capital, and clearly enough capital that would like to invest in projects. So it's something about the creating of markets and improving the basic investment climate and the institutions, all these things that we do with typical ODA and typical public financing, right? It's all about mobilizing private capital and getting the private sector going. We also need to think about then that each financing flow go to where it's fit for its purpose, so to speak. So as I was saying, in some context, the alternative to ODA is really not there. So it's important to ensure that ODA really is there for where no other capital is available, basically. We also need to ensure that since financing is limited, and we've seen in various reports that we need a lot of financing, that also means we need to be much more efficient with the financing we have, which obviously will give more impact per penny that we have, but it will also encourage more private capital to come if it's used for its right purpose. And the technological innovation should not be underestimated. In order to achieve our climate goals, technological innovation, it will be impossible basically if we don't encourage that. And as we know, going back to the basic and understanding why financing doesn't flow to where we want it to flow to begin with, it's really getting the price signals right. We talk a lot about new innovative instruments, guarantees and bonds of different colors and so on. And those are great and very, very important to take a few steps forward. But in the end, we need to arrive at the basics, where it's really creating the right price signals for a green path forward, which is the only path forward. And these second best instrument, if you would like. It's important to get kind of grease the wheels and get going, so that we get closer to really fixing the basics, which is the price signals and the regulations, and that the private sector can then operate within those. In a sense, a bond doesn't have to be colored if we have the right price signals and the right regulations in the economy. But they are extremely important until we get there. Thank you.
Let me build on what Vera and Susanna just shared with us, and perhaps with very specific suggestions to the membership of the Islamic Development Bank, the 57 countries that are served by the Islamic Development Bank and their partners. And it happens that many of these countries are in the African continent, but definitely they are around the world as well, from the east to the west. So what should really be doing specifically in order to deal with these gaps and how to bridge these gaps, either gaps of finance or gaps of technology? And we need definitely to invest better in the human capital and health and education, in the skills of the people and protecting them against shocks. We need to invest in infrastructure, but more now in digital infrastructure. And you need to invest in resilience that includes climate action agenda as being outlined. But when we do that, what is expected from the Islamic Development Bank, and there are lots of discussions about the role of MDBs, because I see them very central in the reports by Vera and Nick and by the G20 as well, that they are central because domestic resource mobilization will benefit a lot from a great deal of guidance on priorities that could really be helped in the design of policies and regulations by the Islamic Development Bank in collaboration with the rest of the MDBs and the IMF. We see as well the importance of the MDBs when they leverage the private sector, and you are the private sector arm of the Islamic Development Bank, like the IFC is to the World Bank. We see the importance of the MDBs in going to places that private sector may be concerned about issues of risk, and perhaps it's more to do with perceived risk rather than actual risk. So that could be another opportunity for the MDBs. And even the bilateral sources of finance that were outlined in these reports, we are aware of many countries, including your home country, for instance, Sweden, while they do a lot of projects and programs for development and climate, but they are more comfortable when they would see the likes of the MDBs with them in the same projects to complement and to scale up and to have a bigger impact. Having said that, there are a few things, given that this is the day of industry and industrialization. And I didn't come across head of state coming from developing economies, especially from Africa, but saying we have been contributing very little to the emissions, but we are suffering the most. The first part I'm very much concerned about, not because I like the African countries or developing economies to contribute like those advanced economies in the past, but basically at the prevailing technology, when you are emitting as a continent of Africa, for instance, no more than 3 to 4% of total emissions. When you are considering, there is another report for the Arab countries, and they are members of, all of them are members of the Islamic Development Bank. Again, the report was saying that the share of the Arab world is no more than 4.5 to 5%. And the story goes on. This is an indication of the fact that at the prevailing technology, these countries suffered from low production and low consumption. It's not a sign of a good thing. Of course, everybody now needs to do better job while you need to consume better and produce better, but with the minimal emission possible at the prevailing technology. What, what my concern is that what we may have today of problems, of poverty, of being lagging behind in different aspects is we're not part of the first industrial revolution. We were exploited, perhaps, as countries, many of us in the developing world, and to be a source of raw material. And the opportunities that Vera was mentioning about the opportunities, especially in mining and the core rare material, we don't like to repeat the old bad story by just being provider of the raw material and consumers of the end products, that we have the evidence that this didn't really work. And you don't need to see the evidence, you just need to go in the different streets in many of the low-income countries, and you see why many countries are poor, and this could be one of the resources, the sources of poverty and inequality as well. So we need to be part of the new industrial revolution. Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution. Now people are talking about a fifth. Regardless the number attached to the industrial revolution, we need to be part of it with higher contribution through the supply chain. This is important. Second, we are aware now that industrial policy is not a taboo anymore, and many countries, including in the US, Europe, they have now new industrial policies based on the green transformation with huge subsidies. So we need not to compete on the subsidies part, but basically to compete on effective policies that could make the transformation. And given that subsidies are not a taboo as well anymore, what we need is better and smarter subsidies and issues related to policies. And in an earlier session, you were talking about the huge subsidies to the hydrocarbon sector. Part, if not all of that, could be reallocated. And then I think there is a great opportunity for the Islamic Development Bank, especially in the industrialization. And again, Vera and I were talking about possibilities of the Islamic Development Bank. Yes, you are doing a great job in many areas of work, but I think it's now the time for technology, smart, green transformation. And as much as the Islamic Development Bank can be doing that, we can start with what we have, because many of the member countries, including the rich ones, like Saudi Arabia, for instance, have a steel industry. Egypt has steel and cement and fertilizers industry. Bahrain has aluminum industry. Senegal has variety of industries in the hard-to-abate sector. I'm just giving that as an example. But surprise, surprise, these industries, when they are going to be exporting to Europe, are going to be subject to something that is going to be effectively as a tax. They are not calling it as a tax or a tariff, but effectively it is. So what we are going to be doing in decarbonizing these sectors, that could be a good starting point. So opportunities from startups to decarbonize what we have of sectors, to building into inclusive growth and sustainable development with huge investments in infrastructure and human capital and resilience. There are many opportunities for the Islamic Development Bank, and I think, and what I expect from Dr. Al-Jasser in particular, with his leadership, with his knowledge, and with his achievements in the past and the present, that the start for the next 50 years need to be strong and bold with great ambitious targets. And we don't need to talk about 50 years from now. We need to talk about 2 years from now, 3 years, 5 years, and we need to focus on 2030, of course.
Thank you very much. Since we are talking about opportunities, first of all, I would like to encourage the audience to go search the TED Talk of Dr. Vera about the Africa swamp, and I think that's a great deal of opportunity. Dr. Mahmoud was referring to the source of fund. We are talking about 2.4 trillion, and he was referring to the locally resource mobilization. We are talking about MDBs of 300 billion and private sector of 500 billion. So going to these opportunities, what can you please tell us about?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Yes, I did a TED Talk, I think 2 years ago now, on the peatlands of Africa. And since then, there has actually been new research that shows that not just the peatlands, but actually the African tropical forest sequester 3 years to 5 years of carbon emissions. And so, yes, there is one side of the conversation, and you're right, Mahmoud, that we haven't heard many African presidents talking about, oh, we didn't do this and we didn't do that. Actually, what more African presidents should be talking about is we are saving the planet. If we didn't have the peatlands and if we didn't have the African tropical forest, we would be at 2% already, right? And so the conversation around carbon and the fact that, you know, this is a positive good, this is a positive externality, and we have to start pricing it, and we have to start paying for it. If we were able to get the resources from carbon for the continent, we're, you know, putting it around 86 to 120 billion dollars. We're talking about 100 billion of all the MDBs together. If we were just pricing carbon, we have $100 billion. And so this is where the domestic resource mobilization comes from. And for us on the continent, this is where the just transition becomes important, and why, you know, Mahmoud and myself and all of us are working really hard on getting the carbon markets to work, because we believe that the fact that the carbon markets are not working is almost another unjust conversation that we're having. We need that market to work. We need it to work quickly so that we can begin to get those resources out and onto the continent. We need it to work with integrity. There is no question about that. But we believe that the faster and the sooner it starts working, the faster and the sooner we get to the integrity. And that's why I am a member of the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, and we're working, we just launched the Energy Transition Accelerator, which is going to begin to test some of the carbon pricing platforms. But we need to go there, and we need to go there very quickly as part of a just transition, but also as part of a just way of giving and allowing Africa to raise equity resources that we could then reinvest. Because it's not just, okay, carbon markets for carbon markets, it's to raise the equity that we need to reinvest in getting our energy going, getting our industrialization going. And I think it's almost impossible for us to meet the investment needs that we are going to have if we are not able to put a price on carbon. The second thing is you have the hard-to-abate sectors, right? They're committed to net zero as well. But because we don't yet have enough of the technology to help the transition happen quickly enough, we need to allow them to be able to buy carbon, to begin to sort of, you know, pay down their emissions while they're working on the technology that is going to allow them to transition their business. And that's why we need a carbon market as well. So the oil and gas sector, for example, they have a windfall of trillions of dollars, but they're also working really hard to figure out how they transition to hydro, to batteries and all that. The IEA, which is the authority on this conversation, says it's going to take us 15 years to get there. But we cannot wait 15 years to make sure that we sequester all the carbon. So you can go and pay Congo, you can pay, you know, the peatlands, you can pay the Amazon, and so that the people of those areas have resources to access better energy, access better education, access better health, and protect the forest. So I think we also need to look at it that way, right? Is that with the peatlands, with the work that we're doing on nature conservancy, and this is the issue, is that there's not enough investment that is going into nature. There is 17% of the investment today on the nature side is going into regeneration. We need to also have some money going into conservation, into changing the agriculture and the way we do it, so that we can wait for the hard-to-abate sectors to find the new technology to transition. And if we look at it that way, then I think we see each other as working in harmony, in partnership, to make sure that we can actually get to our targets of net zero by 2050 in a way that is consistent with creating jobs and delivering prosperity for all of us and healing our planet in general. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with that. I just wanted to also add that addressing poverty is really not endangering climate change goals. And that's incredibly important to come back to. There was just a study by the World Bank published in Nature just now showing that with old technology, if we eradicate extreme poverty, greenhouse gases would increase with 5%. With the best technology, and that's a pretty good assumption going forward, it would increase them with 0.5%. So we can have as a goal to eradicate poverty without endangering any climate goals. So that's very important to come back to. Yeah, and it's also important to think about how important it is to eradicate poverty to even reach the climate goals, because it's when countries grow and increase their capabilities and capacity and financing, that they can go from taking extremely short-term decisions, which you're forced to when you're poor, you don't have enough to eat, and so on. And it's to reach the climate goals, obviously you need more long-term decisions, and it's only possible if we also decrease poverty. Another aspect of it is trust. We have this massive trust gap in many different dimensions between private sector, public sector, climate, development, north, south, and so on. And achieving climate goals and all the other global public goods and global public goals, we cannot have a world that is polarized. So only for that is it important to address extreme poverty and also go beyond that and ensure that people can live a decent life. Otherwise, the other ones are just not possible. And how is this done? Well, poverty reduction is done by promoting the private sector. Promotion of private sector create growth and available financing institutions and everything you need to have a resilient economy. It also creates direct income for people living in poverty, either if they are wage employed, but the vast majority is self-employed. So they are actually the private sector. So that's extremely important to think about. Also, where does tax income come from? It comes from economic activity. And so all the public investments, public services that we need for further growth and for poverty reduction comes from the private sector. So it's essential that we encourage this. What we need in terms of the global debate is to not only think about private investors, that's on the provision of financing side, right? We also need to think about the private sector and the businesses and the people that are actually going to use the finance and ensure that those mechanisms are working from the global investors in New York all the way down to the countries and local communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is really, full of keywords. Usually when you do an article, you put the keywords. I think this is full of keywords. We are talking about smart technology, the role of MDBs, private sector promotion, opportunities, and rebuilding the trust. Some of the keywords that we have. I apologize, there is no time really for Q&A because panels need to run for other businesses. Thank you for accepting the invitation, and thank you for the fruitful discussion.